Our office recently received a letter without a name or return address. It would appear that the author wanted to remain anonymous. In this letter, he explains that the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2 are completely contradictory and therefore should not be taken as real history. And the only way to explain the contradictions as he sees it in the Bible is by reading the text not as the beginning of mankind, but the beginning of national Israel, concluding that Adam and Eve had biological parents. Hello, I'm Jerry Johnson, and I welcome you to this edition of Against the World. This episode of Against the World is brought to you by Biblical Worldview for the 21st Century. See their special book offer, God Confronts Culture, at www.biblicalworldview21.org. And by the CD recording, which proclaims the gospel in 20 minutes. For more information, go to theroadthattakesmehome.com. Due to time constraints, I will not be able to address every fallacy in this letter, but I have to state right here from the beginning that the opening sentence to the last line were the weakest arguments I had ever read. The writer begins his diatribe with the opening statement, quote, "Many Christians prior to the emergence of the historical science of geology interpreted the first chapters of Genesis as literal history," unquote. First, if by literal he means actual, then this is true. For 2,000 years, Christians have, for the most part, agreed that this is actual history and the actual history of the beginning of man. Oh, there have been a few who have injected an allegorical method on the text, but this was not the majority. Besides, even those who held to the fourfold method of interpretation, known as the medieval quadriga, still maintained that the actual history was true, even though they were continually searching for a deeper meaning. But did you notice what the writer said was the true and only valid method of biblical interpretation? Only with the lens of the historical science of geology can one properly interpret the Genesis account. To him, modern science is the interpretive grid from which he views Scripture. And since the science of geology is relatively new, Christians for 2,000 years got it all wrong. As one writer noted, be careful when someone comes to you with the keys for understanding Scripture, especially when their key is a Johnny-come-lately, 2,000 years late. The letter continues to point out what he and others view as the problem with the history between Genesis 1 and 2, most of which is a red herring. But then he pulls the old bait and switch. He focuses in on the history of Cain and Abel and asks who Cain married and who wanted to kill him. He writes, quote, "Some have solved this problem by saying that Adam and Eve have a lot more children that Genesis simply neglects to mention, so Cain married his sister." He continues, "I suppose if one must, he can take refuge in this explanation. But the scenarios seem a bit desperate, not to mention uncomfortable. Plus," he writes, "this explanation is completely made up. God neither hints that the residents of Nod are Adam and Eve's offspring, they are just there." Unquote. Seriously, my friends, it baffles the mind that an intelligent person wrote this statement. First, notice the word some. The writer wants to imply that this explanation is a minority position. Needless to say, he can't prove it's a minority position. It would have been more honest if he would have simply said many instead of some. Second, this is not even a valid argument. What the writer needs to do is document how many commentators in the last 2,000 years have held to the position that he is promoting, that Adam and Eve had biological parents, and the Genesis account is not the creation of man, but of national Israel. Third, he commits the fallacy known as poisoning the well, calling the explanation desperate and uncomfortable. Well, allow me to speak for myself. I neither find it desperate nor uncomfortable. I find it consistent with all of the biblical data. Any way you slice it, my friends, Genesis covers a long period of time, and it records its long history in only 50 chapters. Most commentators I consulted said the time frame for the history of Genesis is anywhere from 1,500 years to 2,000 years. If I cut that in half and said it covered a time period of only 1,000 years, that is roughly still 20 years per chapter. Ergo, it's not meant to be a detailed history. Fourth, I have to ask the question, why is it desperate and uncomfortable? Well, according to our friend, it's completely made up, meaning the text never mentions it. And this is true. However, just because this is true doesn't make his point. This is known in logic as the tu quoque fallacy, accusing an opponent when you yourself are doing the same thing. Isn't his position just as made up? What if we applied his argument to his belief that Adam and Eve had biological parents and Genesis is the historical account of national Israel and not the beginning of mankind? Where in the text does it mention that? Talk about desperate and uncomfortable. Our friend closes by stating that Christians who hold to the historical interpretation are no different than Christians who held to the flat earth. Well, if you've seen my video on the myth of the flat earth, I'm going to have to challenge this man, if he had had the courage to sign his letter and or offer a return address, to give a list of Christian scholars who believe that the earth was flat. It's going to be a very short list. He concludes with this statement, quote, "Many astute scholars today are seeing that Genesis was not developed as a historical record inherently," unquote. His implication is, if you don't hold to his view, then you are not an astute scholar. This is an ad hominem argument at best. I close with this observation by Dr. R.C. Sproul. Although tradition does not rule our interpretation, it does guide it. If upon reading a particular passage, you have come up with an interpretation that has escaped the notice of every other Christian for 2,000 years, or has been championed by universally recognized heretics, chances are pretty good that you had better abandon your interpretation. Until next week, this is Jerry Johnson standing contra mundum against the world.